Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another bonus episode of Season 4. In this episode, Noah will be speaking to the journalist, author, and analyst Anatol Lieven. He's a visiting professor at King's College and a senior fellow at the Quincy Institute. Anatol, in the middle of the Soviet-Afghan War, was in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So he talks to Noah about what he saw while he was there on the ground and offers his thoughts about everything that's happened since. So without further ado, here is Noah's conversation with Anatol Lieven.
Anatol, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Could you just sort of give like a 2-sentence biography of yourself?
Sure. I started off as a British journalist in the 1980s. I started as a freelance in India. Then I was Times correspondent in Pakistan and Afghanistan in the late 80s and covered the Mujahideen war against the Soviets and the communists. And then I spent 7 years I went at the start of 90 when it was still the Soviet Union, and worked there for the Times of London through the period of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the years that followed. And I covered all the wars in this region during that period and wrote several books about it.
And when you came to cover Afghanistan first, I guess for the Times, what were the kind of preconceptions that you had about the conflict there and the Mujahideen and the Soviet occupation and presence?
Of course, the West and the Western media were very hostile to the Soviet intervention, and in many ways, understandably, it was very brutal. But this was portrayed, in the West as part of the Soviet drive for world revolution or to march to the Indian Ocean. And I was a historian by training, and after doing a bit of reading, it soon became apparent to me that there were great similarities to America's involvement in Vietnam, which is to say that the communist regime in Afghanistan by 1979 was collapsing in the face of Islamist rebellion, and the Soviets had the choice, as America did in South Vietnam, by 1963 or so, of either abandoning their regime and letting it fall with all the negative consequences that came from that, or intervening directly.
The fact that the Soviets were now, support in in 1979, they were faced with the question of, do we support this collapsing government or not?
Mm-hmm. The other Western preconception was that this was simply a war between the Soviet occupiers and Mujahideen freedom fighters, when in fact it was a civil war among the Afghans. And the Mujahideen, of course, they had legitimacy on their side, but for years the West completely and deliberately overlooked all the bad sides of the Mujahideen, which became so dreadfully apparent when they won in 1992. Because they looked forward to the Taliban in their extreme religious conservatism, but also because they immediately started fighting among themselves. And we had no excuse for not knowing that, because they'd already started fighting among themselves even while the Soviets were there. And American officials, in particular, some of them, made no secret at all of the fact that they just did not care what happened to Afghanistan. Their only desire was to defeat the Soviet Union and finish off the communists. So that was, for me, a very disillusioning experience, especially because in the summer of '89, after the Soviets had left, some of us, including Christina Lamb of the Financial Times and John Burns of the New York Times, and we got visas to go to Kabul on the communist side. And there, not having spoken to a woman on the Mujahideen side, not being allowed to, being warned very much against it for fear of my life during 6 journeys with the Mujahideen, I went to the university in Kabul and met these women professors, women students, none of whom, had liked the Soviet occupation, all of whom were afraid, with very good reason, of what would happen, when the Mujahideen won. And that whole aspect of things had been totally ignored by the West. And of course, the bitter irony was that 12 years later or more, many former communist soldiers were now fighting for us against the Taliban in Afghanistan.
And when you were, when you got there in the summer of '89, for example, and you met with the communist government, could you talk a little bit more about what some of the, again, some of these myths that you may have had about like what the communist government in Afghanistan was like and what life in Afghan cities was like versus what the kind of, more popular Western narrative about that life was like?
Well, I mean, the communists were undoubtedly an extremely brutal lot. But then, of course, so were many of our allies after 2001. What was very apparent in the Afghan cities, though, was that they were the relative face of modernity and progress in Afghanistan, especially as far as women were concerned, but also more generally. The Afghan army, although it had partially disintegrated and been purged, it was the descendant of the old Afghan royal army, which had existed principally to fight against the tribes and religious uprisings. We helped destroy that army in the 1980s. And then, one of the supreme ironies of history, we tried unsuccessfully after 2001 to put it together again, to fight the descendants, or in some cases the same people, who we had been supporting in the 1980s. That, to me, was also a great lesson in not becoming obsessed with the enemy of the moment, and also, really studying local conditions. And not just studying local conditions, but actually, from an ethical point of view, paying genuine attention to the well-being and the interests of the people of countries concerned, because American administrations and officials talk about that all the time, but in practice, so often they don't give a damn.
And in this case, also, it seems like, to what you said earlier, that from the American perspective, this really was purely about scoring one against the Soviets, and not, really that much more sophisticated beyond that, perhaps until you get into the 1990s. But before we get there, one thing that, is kind of interesting to me is that by the by the time that many in the press sort of start cottoning to the fact that the Mujahideen are some pretty brutal guys, they've already gotten stingers. They've gotten, they've been the recipient for years on end now of a vast international aid program, spanning China, Pakistan, the U.S., South Africa at different points, a very eclectic mix, let's say. What was, I guess, what was the, perspective of the international press, and, what did you see as the potential danger, or, or even just, just what were your impressions at the time of these sorts of, I guess these, future warlords, but these just, emerging, combination of Islamist and Mujahideen fighters, ranging from Abu Sayyaf and Osama bin Laden to, more, people who become a much bigger deal later on, obviously like Ahmad Shah Massoud, but, effectively these, elements of the Mujahideen that will obviously, that to American listeners for sure, an American audience, will go on to be primarily known for another thing.
Well, Massoud, of course, ended as he was killed, but he
was an ally. He was a friend of ours.
He was an ally, yeah. He ended up fighting against the Taliban, and his forces did after 9/11. But other groups, including ones which received huge amounts of Western money and guns, as well as Saudi Arabian guns, already by 1988 had large numbers of Arab volunteers fighting with them, who went on to form Al-Qaeda under Osama bin Laden, who I think I met on one occasion, though of course I had no idea who. Well, he hadn't become.
Wait, what do you mean? You think you met him? Sorry, you tripped and fell, and you might have accidentally met Osama. Say more, please.
No. I met a very tall, unfriendly extremely unfriendly and hostile Arab commander of an Arab force. At the time, he didn't give me his name, and I certainly was not going to try to talk to his men, even if I'd been allowed to. No, it's just, of course, it wasn't until almost 10 years later, with the East Africa bombings, that you began to see his face in the papers, and I thought, I wonder if the guy I met was him. But of course, years had passed, and I couldn't be sure.
But he was really tall.
Yeah, but more to the point, there was this absolutely mendacious line from the CIA and some American officials, after 9/11. That in the 1980s we had no way of knowing that these Arab mujahideen and their Afghan allies were so anti-Western and would turn against us. Well, I vividly remember during the battle for Jalalabad in March of '89, I found myself on a hill where some of the mujahideen groups had established their headquarters, and they were probably Soviet pilots, but anyway, theoretically, the Communist Air Force kept coming over and bombing it. And I was next to this Arab fighter, and we were both of us there was a kind of hole, a very small cave in the side of the hill, and we were both scrabbling with our hands to make it deeper, so that we could hide when the next round of bombs came around. And the bombs came down pretty close and shook earth all over us, and we emerged, both of them, me at least, shaking, and resumed the conversation before we'd gone in, which was that he was cursing me as an American Jew, saying that, as soon as they'd finished the Russians in Afghanistan, they were coming for us, that we were defilers of the holy places and imperialists and racists and all of this. And it did seem a bit hard, since his everything he was wearing had been paid for by the West, but there was no doubt whatsoever about these people's absolute hatred of the West, and America and Israel in particular, of course, as well as, naturally, the Soviet Union and Russia.
And, did you have any conversations with Western officials or, some of the, conduits to the
press? Yes, I recount this in my book on American nationalism. Kathy Gannon and I of Associated Press talked to the head of the U.S. Information Office in Islamabad, very obviously a CIA officer, and we tackled him on this. And we said, by that stage the Soviets were withdrawing. They're leaving, we've won. Why are you going on giving guns and money to mujahideen who are going to be a catastrophe for Afghanistan and their Arab allies? And he eventually just came out straight out and said, I was in Vietnam, we're going to do to them what they did to us. It's not enough to get the Soviets out. We left in '73, but the communists went on to humiliate us by destroying our government. We are going to destroy their government in revenge for Vietnam. And it was absolutely clear that he really did not care how many Afghans died in the process. You do have to remember that, 89 and after was first the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, then in the Soviet Union, then the actual breakup of the Soviet Union, and everything that followed from that. I left Pakistan and Afghanistan literally by accident. I was going into Afghanistan with Steve Levine of the New York Times, and our Jeep crashed.
Who I actually interviewed for this podcast.
Right. Yeah, our Jeep crashed and I was badly injured. And when I came out of hospital in London, having been medevaced, it was, as revolution was happening in Eastern Europe. So the Times never sent me back to Pakistan and Afghanistan. I went back after 9/11 to cover it again. So I suppose I can't really talk, but so much was happening in the world in those years that it was perhaps hardly surprising that media attention shifted.
Yeah, and also it seems, part of it was that, like, once the Soviet Union left, like, a lot of people's dog in the fight suddenly vanished.
Yes.
A part of something that you said earlier about how, when you're recalling your encounter with the Mujahid who was describing his hatred for America and you and Jews and all that, I was thinking, like, yeah, you know what? And the fact that we paid for all that shit on his back really shows that the only thing that's stronger than his hatred is our hatred for the Soviet Union.
Exactly.
Which is pretty striking. But sort of, to your point about the collapse of the Soviet Union, I quote, and I think we use in the spine of the podcast, Vladislav Zubak's book Collapse, which is, I think is terrific. Mm-hmm. And one of the things in it that struck me was the extent to which the, U.S., like in his telling, it really seems that as Gorbachev was sort of, effectively negotiating away Soviet support for Afghanistan, that this was part of the sweep of events that we associate, leading up to the collapse. To what extent do you view, and what role do you assign the Afghanistan fiasco, and specifically the withdrawal at the time of, during the period of collapse, in the actual collapse of the Soviet Union?
I think it played a contributory factor in terms of undermining, Soviet prestige, and perhaps also in the disillusionment of the army. Because the biggest puzzle about the fall of the Soviet Union is why the Soviet army did not intervene, very forcefully and bloodily and effectively to hold the place together. Even Indian soldiers, who by and large do respect democracy, have told me that, of course, they would seize power in order to prevent, the Indian Union from disintegrating. So it could be that Afghanistan contributed to that. But to be honest, far, far more important was, obviously, Soviet economic failure and nationalism, and in Eastern Europe, and the desire, to be free of Moscow's control, starting with the elections in Poland in June of '89, and then obviously the kind of semi-revolt in Hungary and in Eastern Europe and in East Germany. Those were the critical things, and then of course the spread of this to the Soviet Union itself, to the Baltic and the Caucasus.
And sort of before we leave this time frame, I'm curious about the degree to which what role, and because I do want to return to Ukraine again, but I want to sort of come to it at this moment too, to ask what role you think in terms of Western thinking, or Russian thinking, the Afghan conflict period from the 80s up until the Soviet withdrawal, has had on how the people fighting the war today, how it's influencing their actions. We're obviously recording this in fairly early July 2023, so everything could change, as it always does. But, just sort of broadly speaking, now that the war has been going on for over a year and we can see some of what its contours are.
I don't know that it's affected the way of fighting the war very much. After the Afghan war, of course, there were two very bloody wars in Chechnya. I think a lot of what's happening in Ukraine is more in the very nature of urban conflict and insurgency and counterinsurgency. But in circumstances where obviously you have brutalized and demoralized and indisciplined troops suffering very heavy casualties. In that sense, yes, I mean, it's like Afghanistan in a way. It's very like Vietnam in certain respects, but it's also just like war, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. And I also think that part of, to me, what's interesting in Afghanistan is just perhaps the way in which it's viewed as, like, still, even after 9/11 and all this stuff, as a historic victory for the West, as, like, because it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is also, it's another bad thing that, like, or another, like, just unequivocally catastrophic thing that is viewed as having been a win for the West.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's deeply stupid. Because, I mean, if only because, as I say, I mean, the thing that really brought the Soviet Union down was its own, economic inefficiency plus nationalism. Afghanistan and Western aid for Afghanistan was A, peripheral, and B, of course, as you said, had the most terrible effects on America later, partly in terms of 9/11, but also, of course, in terms of partly provoking and partly legitimizing the Bush administration into launching, these disastrous invasions.
And so when you get to, I mean, it's kind of the JFK assassination in a lot of ways, I suppose, for people of a certain age. In which I include myself, because I grew up fairly close. But, where were you in 9/11, and to what extent? It sounds like it really, that, like, 9/11 was influential in changing, or at least, like, shaping the direction of the reporting and work that you did afterward, and coming back to this region.
Yeah, well, I mean, on 9/11, I was in the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I was working there in Washington. I was working on Russia and the former Soviet Union. I was actually writing something on Georgia at the time. My wife was in New York that day because she was studying at the Pratt Institute for Design. Thank God. I mean, she was not involved in the attacks. But yes, I mean, it changed my trajectory, because when 9/11 happened, I was the only person then working for the Carnegie Endowment who had actually lived and worked in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So, of course, they asked me to drop everything, and I volunteered to go back there. And I was on a plane to Pakistan within a week of 9/11. And after that, well, first, I mean, for most of the next 20 years with interruptions, I concentrated more than anything else on what was happening in Pakistan and Afghanistan. But on the other hand, because I was covering the war on terror and the Muslim world, I was also a strong opponent of the invasion of Iraq, in opposition which I have to say cost me very heavily in terms of career and income and everything else. But because of that, and because of the way in which I saw the reaction to 9/11 and how it had been exploited by the Bush administration, I wrote a book about American nationalism, and in particular the two strands, which were so exemplified by the Bush administration, both at the same time, of, tremendous chauvinist militarism, but at the same time, and even, I mean, to a genuinely, at least for many of them, not all, this genuine belief in America's mission to spread democracy and freedom to the whole world, by bombing if necessary. And this mixture fascinated me, horrified me, and so I wrote a book about that, which was extremely unpopular.
And in the case of, your authority on Pakistan, through the 1990s into the 2000s is, it's a complicated, I mean, since partition, it was, sort of, it's viewed historically, and the elite based out of the capital, the military elite, the Muslim military elite, is, views itself as having got, and it objectively they got like the lesser half of the partition. They got the losing end of that bargain. And what's more, that there is also this still like massive like archaic inequality and land inequality in particular within the country, and also many millions of people, and a history of being like a really influential like almost like merchant civilization. And I'm sort of curious, I guess, just kind of how you came to, you wrote a book on Pakistan in particular, Pakistan, a Hard Country. I'm sort of just curious about like how you came, what your idea, what you view of, or I guess like what your view of Afghanistan is, how you came to form it, what kind of place you think of it as, what its government is like, and so on.
Pakistan.
Yes.
Well, I mean, what came to strike me very forcefully was that was two things. I mean, one was that under the the surface instability of Pakistani politics, and these coups and rumors of coups and forced government changes and so forth and so on, there was actually a deep stability to the Pakistani political system, because it was rooted in kinship networks, to some extent, you could say feudal allegiances, though that word is actually pretty inaccurate. And the extraction of money from the state by more or less corrupt means, but also its distribution, not simply its theft and transfer to London or whatever, but its distribution to political followers. And this led to a funny degree of stability in the country. And then, of course, as the ultimate guarantor of the survival of the country, you have the military, which, except Bangladesh, which could not in the end be held, has always managed to put down revolts and hold Pakistan together. So I thought that a lot of the reporting by, I'm sorry to say, some either foolish or opportunist Pakistani journalists, as well as badly informed Western ones, about how Pakistan was on the brink of Islamic revolution, was quite mistaken, and I predicted very accurately, as it turned out, that the army would suppress the Pakistani Taliban revolt.
So just to stay with that for a minute, like, what are the sort of like competing tensions there? Like, are there influential religious institutions that could theoretically challenge the military in the way that, like, assuming that like the Iranian, which again it's a Shia revolution, but like still that the Iranian revolution is the blueprint? Is there a sort of like meaningful, to your point, you're saying that this is fundamentally a stable system. I guess part of what you're saying is that no, there isn't, and that the army can dispatch with these elements pretty effectively.
For the moment.
For the moment.
Well, I mean, there are two things. I mean, first is Shiism is quite different, and the whole Iranian experience was quite different.
Well, yeah, that's why I immediately kind of hedged that one.
Yeah, because Pakistani Islam is very divided. And the Islamist parties are and groups are very divided among themselves. And there are also, of course, deep provincial divisions and divisions within provinces. But that has been, the case for a very long time now. And the formal religious parties, although they sympathized in some ways with the Taliban, they have also been themselves attached to the state patronage network for many, many decades. I talked to one of their leaders this was under the government of Benazir's widower.
Benazir Bhutto.
Yeah, President Zardari. And this this Islamist leader was savagely attacking the Zardari government, accusing them of being slaves of the Americans and infidels and corrupt and so forth. And I eventually said to him, Amir Saab, that's very interesting, but in Parliament, you support the government. And he looked at me and he said, but look, our followers vote for us so that we can get jobs and benefits for them. We can only get that if we support the government. And I felt like saying, well, thank you. Yes, that's what everyone has been saying about you for many years now. Thank you for confirming it. But basically, you're in it for the money. But what I was going to say was that there is a Janus-faced aspect of Pakistani stability or underlying stability, which is that it is universally by definition dreadful for development, because the money that should be going to building infrastructure, import substitution, industrial development, energy, is siphoned off in state, in patronage to politicians and their followers. And if Pakistan goes on, with its, as it has for the past almost 50 years now, I have grave doubts about whether it will survive climate change. From a mixture of just lack of development, still steep population growth, and even without climate change, growing water shortages in a country which is acutely vulnerable to water stress. So, in the short term, I've been an optimist concerning Pakistan, but not in the long term.
And as it relates to Pakistan's, interest in Afghanistan, I think one of the things that's always kind of struck me is that, Pakistan and the Pakistani government, and specifically the ISI, can be credited with, with the creation of the Taliban and functionally with controlling the destiny of Afghanistan's politics for, a quarter century. And at the same time, though, it's always like that, that obviously sort of leaves out, of course, where did Pakistan get the money to do that, et cetera. But, that does sort of acknowledge that, Pakistan has a sort of native interest in, let's say, policing the Durand Line, to put it mildly. What is the basis for that, geopolitical interest of Pakistan? That sort of historic position of trying to leverage the Pashtun kinship relationships into, helping to enforce a kind of peaceable, if not hegemonic, relationship?
Well, there are two elements involved. The first, as you say, is the desire to exert enough influence over Afghanistan that Afghanistan does not become an ally of India, at which point, Pakistan is surrounded and, vulnerable to all kinds of pressure from Afghanistan. So that's always been the core military agenda, and why they've supported a succession of rebel groups in Afghanistan. As, by the way, intermittently, Afghan governments have supported rebel groups in Pakistan. So, both sides have played this game. But the thing is, it also should not be ignored, the fact that this was not simply, a military action. The Mujahideen in the 80s and the Taliban, against us, enjoyed colossal popular support among the Pashtuns of Pakistan. You have to remember there are considerably more Pashtuns live in Pakistan than live in Afghanistan. And a great many of them, in the tribal areas and along the border, belong to the same tribes as people on the Afghan side and identify with them very closely.
Well, and also there was, just to cut in, is also just to mention, because we haven't mentioned it till now, the role of the madrasas on either side of the border, but that were funded often through Pakistan, and which just speaks to shared educational or doctrinal relationships that get established during that time.
That's true, but there's Winston Churchill. But there's a very good book by Sana Haroun called Frontier of Faith, in which he traces the fact that the religious roots of the Taliban and resistance to religiously inspired resistance to foreign conquest in Afghanistan, you can trace, directly back to resistance to the British, of course, virtually for the entire period of the British presence on that frontier. And by the way, first the Mujahideen and then the Taliban were absolutely conscious of being part of this tradition and legacy, and talked and wrote and sang about it all the time. But you see the other thing, among the Pashtuns, and I heard this from people there again and again, there was an Islamist commander who was later killed in an American drone strike, and he said, he was talking in about 2003, he said, look, 20 years ago, foreign invaders, non-Muslims, came to Afghanistan, and you praised us, you armed us, and helped us to kick them out. 20 years later, foreign invaders come to Afghanistan, and we're supposed to lick their boots, he said. Well, we're not going to do it. He was a Pakistani Pashtun, you see. But, to a great extent along that border, at least in the areas of Pakistan immediately along the border, it doesn't hugely matter whether you're a Pakistani Pashtun or an Afghan one, especially because, of course, ever since the late 1970s, millions of Afghan refugees have come across and basically merged with the local Pashtun population. So obviously there was a Pakistani military strategy there, but there was also a tremendous degree
the Deobandi religious tradition.
Well, and Pashtun,
but just not to just lump it all into one thing, but to describe that there were some discrete and distinct religion, part of what I'm trying to just affirm what you're saying is that there are both discrete indigenous and some less so, not saying that they're illegitimate or any reason for not being that way, religious traditions that are structured around this this resistance to foreign non-Muslim intervention.
Exactly. Yes.
And in the case of, sort of where the global war on terror comes in after 9/11, your work in the 2000s, I guess, where did you see the kind of, where did you want to put emphasis based on what you saw on the ground and, coming back to it, what struck you as the most important elements of the story then unfolding? And aside from the catastrophe of the Iraq War.
Well, in Afghanistan, something that was always apparent to me, I never traveled with the Taliban, though I talked to their supporters as much as I possibly could in Pakistan and even in Kabul. But in a certain sense, to understand where the Taliban were coming from, I felt I almost didn't need to travel with them because I had traveled with them. Many of the areas that I visited in the late 1980s were precisely the same areas where the Taliban were recruiting and had their bases and from which they were fighting in southern and eastern Afghanistan against us and our Afghan allies after 2001. The same people, or their sons and grandsons, for the same reasons. And I was absolutely horrified and infuriated by the way in which people in the West, including, I have to say, some journalists who had been there in the 1980s and really should have known better, portrayed the Taliban as an alien force, as alien to Afghanistan, who parroted propaganda about them, being all Pakistanis, or that they had a Saudi Arabian ideology, a Wahhabi ideology, which was alien to the Afghan population. The point is, it was certainly alien to the old Afghan urban population of Kabul, yes. But the Taliban were absolutely rooted in the conservative Pashtun tradition of southern and eastern Afghanistan.
Right, and it also sort of obfuscates the more like overt and material hand that the Pakistani government and ISI had in, establishing the Taliban as an effective military and organized political force. It's sort of like the Taliban is sort of born out of like a dispute of like the Kandahar trucking mafia, as the story goes. To what extent, was the war when it got to the, war in after 9/11 and this long, 20-year war begins, I guess now that the Western government and the Western occupied and supported government in Afghanistan has collapsed, and it only took a few days. What did you see, I guess, as like, the kind of failures that accreted over time that led to that event?
It was, first, obviously, there was an excellent article by Anand Gopal about this soon after the Taliban had won, pointing out that we basically won the partial safety of the cities, or security of the cities, with the total insecurity of the Pashtun countryside. Constant drone attacks. And what one has to understand is that, the appalling lack of understanding of Afghan rural society, in which, just because a Taliban local commander comes to a wedding, if his cousin, or whatever, somebody important from the tribe is getting married, you're going to come to that. And by the way, you may well have a local official coming to it as well. It doesn't mean that everybody at that wedding party is a supporter of the Taliban. And by the way, even if they are, that's no excuse for firing a drone, which then kills 50 women and children. And of course, the colossal resentment and hatred that stirred up.
Well, and then relatedly, to what extent did you view eventually in time, that we've heard, and the headlines have persisted, of that sort of event going on for 15, 20 years, et cetera, and moving from, airstrikes to drones, to like an evolution. We've developed technology to accommodate pursuing those kinds of ends with greater ease. In spite of the, pretty clear bad dividends, let's say, that pays, why did it persist, do you think?
I think, the strategy was more or less on autopilot. They didn't know what else to do. And of course, they were also trying, as far as possible, to spare the lives of American troops. And of course, it's much easier from that point of view to have an air campaign, especially an air campaign with unmanned vehicles. And it did. Not in the same way, but I think in many ways replicate the experience of Vietnam.
No, the last question I was just going to ask was about basically now that the American supported government in Kabul has collapsed and the Taliban are back in power, what would you say, we've learned about what the Taliban wants and the Taliban government is and wants? What is the hard fact that we can glean about what its interests are and what it seeks to do and what life is like for people there?
The Taliban have changed very little, really, it seems, in their basic ideology from when they were in power before. They've become, I'm happy to say, more tolerant of minorities. There's much less, persecution of minorities. They're also fighting hard against ISIS, against the local version of ISIS, who are even more extreme and are also dedicated to international terrorism. But the basic ideology of the Taliban has not changed, and of course, expecting it to change would be a bit odd, because they have, after all, won. They won against colossal odds, having suffered enormous casualties over the years and held out with, it has to be said, tremendous courage and resilience. Well, a force like that, which has won a victory, is not going to listen to the people who it defeated. But unfortunately, that does mean a very conservative regime, which is, of course, amongst other things, it's dedicated to its idea of women's rights, which are, physical safety plus a traditional role in the home, but of course completely hostile to any modern idea of women's rights, and with no idea at all about how to develop the country. But, I fear that was very much to be expected, alas.
Thank you for giving me a crazy amount of time at an ungodly hour for you.
Sure, it was a pleasure. And do send me a link, would you?
All right, that was Noah's conversation with Anatol Lieven. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.